So I sat here this morning up till about lunch, wondering whether I'd prepared the right address. I think warfare didn't get mentioned till the first presentation after lunch. And I was coming to the conclusion that perhaps I didn't understand what littoral meant. Maybe it meant doing things in uniform other than fighting wars. So if you don't mind, I'm going to steer this thing in another direction, which we've started to take it in, and I'm going to talk about warfare. And I'm going to talk about something that that you might find surprising, not if you've read some of the stuff that we've been producing recently in the Army, and also that I'm here having had something to do with the amphibious capability a few years ago, but I'm going to talk about precision and long weapons and long-range strike, and particularly land-based precision weapons and long-range strike. Now, as you know, the Australian government intends to acquire land-based strike capabilities in the 2020s. Given Australia's geography, it's extraordinary that it's taken us this long to do so. Perhaps, I think, for too long, Australia's strategic community has seen national defence as primarily a matter for air and naval forces, I think conveniently defining Australia's approaches as an air-sea gap, dating back, of course, to 1987, when in fact Australia's approaches are more analogous to a bridge made of air, sea and land, and of course that's not my idea, I'm borrowing that from somebody else. So the ADF's thinking about land-based precision weapons is in its infancy. I think the Army is largely at fault for this absence of thought about the potential role of land-based precision strike in Australia's strategy. For example, if I were to ask some of you to describe in a few words the Army's thinking about warfare and strategy, or how it's thought about it over the last 2 decades, I think that your answer would have one or two common features. You might suggest that the Army's thinking has been about its role in small constabulary or stabilisation missions, such as those characterised by Interfet, Ramsey, or maybe humanitarian assistance like Fiji Assist. Or your other answer might be that the Army's thinking has been about contributing forces to international coalitions to counter insurgencies in partner nations, or intervening in partner nations, particularly in David Kilcullen's littoral megacities, sort of analogous to an Afghanistan or Iraq, but conducted in Lagos or something seems to be the flavour recently. So in other words, the Army's thoughts have been on small wars. Now that situation's probably understandable. Small wars, stabilisation missions, disaster relief missions are, after all, what the Army's been doing continuously for about 2 decades now. In fact, notwithstanding the Korean War, since World War II, that is almost entirely what the Army has been doing. So I wonder whether small wars are perhaps a theoretical comfort zone for the Army, which it tends to want to re-explore. I wonder whether its tendency is to repackage the old small wars theories and ideas in new buzzwords and new contexts. The problem is that small wars tend to be somewhat of a joint-free zone. And I'm getting some nods from those nodding in green uniform. Except, I suppose, for the coordination of intelligence, reconnaissance, surveillance, for raids and assassinations of insurgents or terrorists, the sort of thing that has become the sine qua non of special operations. I think that they really are, to some extent, a joint-free zone. But let's be frank, dealing with urban insurgents is hardly a complex joint endeavour in the way that denying an area or a line of communication to a peer adversary is likely to be, or even more challenging would be penetrating an enemy's envelope provided by his precision weapons. In the former case, aircraft fly with impunity, for example, and sea lift might suffice in lieu of amphibious capability. These happy circumstances are unlikely to exist in the latter cases I offered. So the Australian government's decision to acquire land-based strike capabilities in the 2020s might be just the thing that might break the Army's thinking comfort zone, or its narrow pattern of thinking. That's not to say that the Army should stop thinking about small wars, rather that it ought to broaden its horizons, so to speak. New deployable land-based anti-ship missiles, a long-range rocket system, armed medium-altitude unmanned aircraft and a mobile surface-to-air missile system will enable the ADF to strike deep into Australia's maritime and air approaches and to dominate the sea and air from the land. We therefore must broaden our horizons. And while these sorts of capabilities are not new to many of the armies of the world, I think they signify a revolutionary change to the character of the Australian Army. Now, the Army's most recent foray into the field of precision weapons and land-based strike was a discussion paper by Al Palazzo and me, in which we attempted to mobilise a broad community of interest to help us to think about this particular problem. It explores big ideas, but perhaps disappointingly offers few answers. Nonetheless, we made the bold assertion that the changes that these weapons are causing in the art of war are not only likely to be significant, they may potentially tip the balance in favour of the defender and away from the offence. Where's Peter Dean? I know you don't agree with our slant on that, but to some extent what we've tried to do is to actually be bold and make some assertions and explore some hypotheses, at least to invite a discussion and a debate around the subject. So long-range precision missiles combined with advanced sensors give the defender the potential to create killing zones with enormous depth encompassing the air, sea and the land. Tactics that currently allow an attacker to manoeuvre in the face of fire and close with an enemy may become too expensive and uncertain to attempt. A lodgement on a shore protected by an enemy armed with precision missiles may become all but impossible without incurring great losses of people and machines. And interestingly, a lot of the discussion this morning about amphibious operations hasn't even gone anywhere near the possibility of even a country and a small country acquiring or having given to them by somebody who could produce these technologies, these sorts of systems. Now the fact that these things might be true and that it might favour the defence is a good thing if Australia's defence policy was solely focused on national territorial defence. However, the government recognises that Australia's security and prosperity are directly affected by events outside the region and are not just linked to geography or confronting threats in Australia's maritime approaches. So we argue that the most difficult challenge for us may be manoeuvring in the face of an adversary's anti-excess envelope. If the advantage in warfare has tipped decisively in favour of the defender, as is likely, given the global scope of Australia's defence interests, it may be important for the ADF that the balance in warfare be returned to a more neutral setting between the attacker and the defender. Now, we've seen in the eastern Ukraine how the density of modern systems may mean that in future they may be resilient to long-range precision counterstrikes and electronic attack. And as the thresholds and cost of access to missiles and advanced sensors reduce, these systems may proliferate and become commonplace, perhaps possessed by lesser powers and even non-state actors. So the reduction of these systems may necessitate the involvement of ground forces. And I think it's fair to say that the problem of dealing with these systems has, by and large, internationally been seen primarily as a problem for air forces and, to a lesser extent, navies and also special forces. Developing ways to penetrate and manoeuvre within an enemy's area denial envelope is a major challenge to which we are just beginning to put our minds. The experience of the First World War suggests that those same ideas that overcame the defensive anti-excess envelope then, the no man's land of the Western Front, can be reconceptualised in ways that will restore the equilibrium between the defence and the offence now. For example, novel ways of employing decoys, electronic warfare and cyber may assist in crossing the enemy's anti-access envelope and to immobilise it. How this will be achieved still needs to be determined, but the potential is there. It might also be possible to infiltrate small parties of soldiers into and through the area covered by the enemy's precision strike. These troops, once across, might coalesce into larger bodies to attack and reduce the envelope, thereby making it easier and safer for the main force and other strike capabilities to come in behind. After all, a resilient A2AD system would require the defender to disperse their troops to protect the many nodes. Dispersion and disaggregation seem to be important features of any new tactics and will require some very innovative ideas about supplying and maintaining our forces. And I think that that is not just a land force problem, that is a joint problem. However, the easiest way to negate the defender's strength may be to have troops already inside the anti-access window before a conflict commences. And of course, this would require us to have access to another country's territory, and it is of course firstly a question of diplomacy and arrangement with a partner state. Nonetheless, by pre-positioning forces forward, the strength of an adversary's anti-access envelope may be considerably reduced, allowing access by the ADF's land, sea and air forces. So regional and international engagement and cooperation are a critical precondition. Now, the effect of this combination on tactics is already being felt, and I apologise for the quality of that image. From the former Yugoslavia to Gaza, Chechnya, Afghanistan and even the present war with ISIS, adversaries are seeking the cover of difficult terrain. And it might be argued, because I'm about to use a Pacific example in an analogy in the Second World War, that this was the case even then. They are hiding in features such as cities, mountains, caves, tunnels and jungles to avoid the firepower of their more powerful opponent. Moreover, hiding amongst targets that cannot be attacked, such as civilians or critical infrastructure, increases the potential political cost on adversaries. When a force fails to take such precautions, the results can be devastating. In the Ukraine, for example, we've seen that troops caught in the open have suffered greatly. Russian sensors easily found Ukrainian troops in exposed positions, and coordinated rocket and artillery fire followed soon after. This seems to suggest that large battles in open country may become prohibitively expensive and increasingly rare, whereas battles in close and complex terrain will be the norm, if not so already. Some land forces, such as ISIS, have recognised the danger and adjusted their tactics to minimise the risk to their operations. ISIS forces now tend to move across open ground in small groups that are barely detectable and represent a small reward for the expenditure of expensive advanced munitions. Now, this method contrasts with the large convoys of vehicles in which its troops once boldly raced across Iraq and Syria. ISIS troops only form into larger groups in the relative safety of close urban terrain, where they're more able to avoid detection and are more willing to accept combat. So land warfare, if not warfare broadly, seems to resemble the island-hopping campaign in the Western Pacific of the Second World War. Close terrain is akin to the islands from which the Japanese established their fortresses. Open terrain is like the oceans between, except that now the oceans are open spaces, are far more dangerous places to be, and where troops and platforms are most vulnerable. It is no surprise, therefore, that the fighting to recapture territory from ISIS in Iraq is characterised by a series of battles for cities and towns. But we also think that this metaphor is more broadly useful when thinking about employing precision weapons. It's not just a land warfare metaphor. Just as the US Army, the US Marine Corps and the Australian Army seized islands and coastal airstrips to advance our air forces in the Pacific in World War II, so too land forces may be necessary to project and defend long-range strike capabilities in the future. In other words, general purpose land forces will need to be enablers for long-range strike. This idea is very important for the Army. It's fair to say that it has traditionally seen itself, perhaps subconsciously, as the end to which everything else in the ADF works to support and enable. The suggestion here is that general purpose ground forces will serve to seize and hold locations from which long-range strike is made possible. Point protection of land-based strike systems and airfields for airstrikes by manned and unmanned aircraft may become a major feature of Australian tactics in order to enable the denial of portions of the ocean and the air. To use the World War I analogy again, just as riflemen served primarily to protect machine guns in the tactics on the Western Front, and machine guns, of course, were one of the primary killing systems that dominated no man's land, general purpose land forces may be in future often serve to protect and enable precision strike, which may be the primary killing system in new no man's lands of much greater scale and encompassing both the land, air and sea. So to bring these ideas and threads together, it's likely that in a regional conflict involving precision weapons, cities, towns and other complex terrain in the littoral may become the metaphorical machine gun nests for precision strike systems, defended by general purpose ground forces. And it may just be that rather than seeing littoral cities as something our future enemies will already exist within, compelling us to go in and winkle them out, maybe we need to consider that there is great advantage to seizing them before our foe does, compelling them to winkle us out. After all, and forgive me if I've taken this quite out of context, but I understand a ship's a fool to fight a fort, or so it is said. Now, these ideas for the time being are just that, they're just ideas, and we certainly, I can speak for Al, don't presume to suggest that this is the future of warfare. It's where we necessarily need to be, nor are our analogies relevant. But what we are trying to do is to explore an idea and pursue some debate, and at least break ADF, or at least Army thinking, out of a traditional mould. And I think it would seem that this subject of area denial and the more difficult problem of penetrating an enemy's envelope energises all three services in a similar way. And so it might just be this particular subject gives our services a common joint focus. It's probably reasonable to assert that a joint force that can resolve the problems of area denial and the penetration of such is capable of cooperating in all circumstances. In other words, a joint effort to resolve this problem might just be the thing that makes us truly joint. For example, such a force would require a joint digital system that will allow targets discovered and tracked by forces in one domain to be engaged from strike capabilities in another. Developing a joint sensor-shooter network is therefore perhaps our first priority. But equally important will be addressing the age-old problem of getting there firstest with the mostest, but over much greater distances and across multiple domains. In other words, working out how to get joint forces across vast vulnerable spaces quickly and safely must come a close second. So while I understand the discussion today is the littoral, the point I'm trying to make is I don't think you can separate that the littoral from the broader open spaces that you're required to cross in order to get and work within that environment. So that concludes my short presentation. I hope that's enough to energise a bit of thinking and some questions. So of course we'll take questions, but if you actually have any thoughts on this, and we're particularly keen on thoughts that challenge what we've thrown out there, by all means contribute. And I'm inviting you to write very quickly and simply and do it raw to our Land Power Forum so that we can actually get this debate going and try to bring the Army or Land Forces into a discussion that I think has been dominated by Air Forces and the Navy for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Yes, please. Could you identify yourselves and wait for the microphone?
Afternoon again, sir. Noting your point of defensive systems potentially being in the ascendancy and precision systems not being anything new, in fact having been more and more widely proliferated over the last conservatively 3 decades, and the fact that they're now citing Yemen even proliferated to non-state actors, what is it that's changed recently today to really precipitate your point of we're now in a new area where these systems are in fact nothing new?
Yeah, look, I don't know. Are you asking indirectly why has it taken the Army so long to work this out? Or
I wouldn't say that I was asking that, sir.
I'm not sure, and I wasn't in my area in Army headquarters when the last force structure review and white paper production occurred. I think that the genesis for the idea actually did come from within the Army, so I don't think it might be portrayed as if we were dragged into it and now we're only responding to it. But no, I'm not sure what has woken us up to this. No, all I can say, as I said before, it's probably been a long time coming. You don't know, Al, what drove us to this point right now? No.
Thank you. Sir Chris McGregor, I'm in the guided weapons acquisition space at the moment, and there's certainly a hole when it comes to Army. The burden's largely carried by Air Force engineers there. How do you see the Army personnel space responding to this new challenge in terms of skill sets and, dare I say it, attitude, in particularly like the guided weapons space, but also the C4, that targeting and sensor domain, where you're really going into either new areas or certainly a massive expansion of older capabilities?
Yeah, mate, all I can tell you is that we are literally only just starting to think about it. You know, there's a recognition that we will need to change workforce. I tell you what, I'll give you an example. It's not about this, but it gives you a sense that there's a recognition in the Army of what's coming and what we need to do, and that's the cyber workforce. And we've sat down in a number of working groups with our Director General Career Management, Director General Personnel, me, Director General Modernisation, Deputy Chief of Army and others to explore this. We sat there thinking that we might have the answers at the table, and then there was a sort of a recognition that you know what, we're making the age-old mistake to think that we'll come up with the answer now, set the end, and then set the neat target to it, and that everybody knows what to do, we'll head towards it. We recognise that we didn't quite understand even what the problem is. So the Army's response will be to put a team together with a view to seeking ideas beyond that limited staff. The answer for this will be the same. So it might be disappointing, but no, we have no particular plans on how we adjust the workforce and so on. We're at the stage now of a concept that explores some general ideas of what it means to have these sorts of things. We haven't even decided, for example, that where they might sit in an organisational extent. So look, it's probably a disappointing answer, but no.
Peter Dean from ANU. I thought I'd ask a question because you used my name in vain. I suppose my question's about Army culture.
Yeah.
I mean, Army's been fundamentally an infantry-based orientated force.
Yeah.
One would say it's only just making the journey from a light to a medium weight.
That's right.
Infantry force in many regards. So how do you think your ideas would be impacted on the notion of what is supported and supporting in Army?
Yeah.
And that gets to the way that Army force structures itself, and how that change might be resisted by the fact that we've got a culture in Army that's dominated in one way. This is, to my mind, not only a change in the way of warfare, but would take a fundamental change in the way that Army's culture works and its structure works as well.
Absolutely. And I'll try to give you a sense. So the first point to make, Peter, is that, I mean, that exists. That's absolutely right. And of course we have an Army where a good portion of it, if it's not infantry, at least it believes that the centrepiece of the Army is the combat brigade, which in any other army would be called an infantry brigade. But, in this, the concept I showed before, in material that we've produced for CASAG over the last 18 months, we've been discussing the problem of balancing the Army's establishment. And in essence, the essence of the argument is to suggest that we are, how do I put this? We have, for a force of 30,000 regulars, we probably have ample combat forces. Now, I say that cautiously because in fact we actually don't have much. But in a relative sense, we have ample. When you compare to things that the joint community relies on, that the Army provides, intelligence capabilities and so on. As part of this rebalancing, we took recently to CASAG recommendations for transitioning combat forces to logistics forces and to other enabling forces. At the very top of the Army, this is accepted. And to some extent, and dare I say it, special operations are leading the way. This has been recognised by them for a long period of time that, a very small number of operators are enabled by a comprehensive back end of enabling and logistic support. That message is just starting to wash through. But getting to the particular difficult part of your question is to what extent, other than in Army headquarters or a few senior officers and so on, is that getting through? I don't. I'm just being cautious of how I put this. As part of bringing the Army along on the journey, the solutions that we were coming to, that is looking at particular capabilities to transition, a portion of those options were then put to the combat brigades. And the way they were put to them was to constrain them to consider a combat brigade with fewer numbers, how you might apportion those numbers inside that brigade. In one case that I know of, the immediate response back was, no, you've given us the wrong problem. We should be looking at how we can increase the size of the combat brigade, because I know things that exist outside the combat brigade that I could take away in an instant. And it was looking at things like long range, so heavy transport and other theatre sustaining capabilities, which for an Australian-led operation, which would be our most challenging, are the things that we would really need and the things that would probably light on. It's certainly a cultural challenge, and the resistance is there, and I can only suggest it'll take a considerable time before we address it. And look, I say this as somebody who 2 years ago was making the case that potentially we were at risk of becoming, to use General Krause's terms, all tinsel and no tree. That is, all enabling capability, but no combat capability to actually enable. That of course is a misguided view. But it'll take a while to change. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Colonel, thank you for your contribution to the discussion of warfare this afternoon. I'm not going to be cautious, but I'd like to give you a brief anecdote. The late Tony Ayres, a former Secretary of the Department of Defence, in response to a statement from a journalist, said to him, "You need to understand, young man, that the business of the Department of Defence is killing people." Thank you.
Absolutely.
So to what extent is the Army in an equivalent situation to the post-Vietnam world, post-Afghanistan? Is it looking for a role, or are new roles inevitably going to be thrust upon it? The post-Vietnam was a long lull. I don't suspect you think that you've got a lull.
No, there was concern. I know in 2013, 2014, there was a discussion inside the Army that we were on the path to a post-Vietnam period and its consequences. I've heard some people suggest, and I think there is some truth to it, that Vietnam was the closing of the Australian Army's mind, that it was a war where those who did the fighting were platoon commanders, and over a period of 20 or 30 years they then... no, I won't go down that. There was some concern, but I don't think we have that problem at all. And look, I don't think that what I've said today is actually, I can actually guarantee it wasn't a response to that particular problem. This is simply a recognition that this is where we ought to be, not trying to find a role. Yeah.
Colonel, on that note, thank you very much for an enlightening address and reminding us that ultimately it's all about war fighting. Thank you very much indeed.